We're in the process of getting everything ready to remove the rear casing and replace the distance sensor. This is a 981 Boxster. To get access to this, and you don't have to do everything I'm going to talk about now. You can get access to this with the bumper still in place, but as you can see, with everything at the back here removed, you get amazing access to everything. To be honest, the back of the transmission feels like it's sitting on a transmission stand. It's just so easy to get my hands around at everything. I would personally do this if I was doing this to a car that I was going to drive. So the time that it's taken me to get to this point here is a little bit over an hour. These cars are so easy to pull apart that getting to this stage was actually pretty simple. I'll talk you through now what I've done. Most of this I've already made videos on before, so I'll put links to that in the description, but a few things that I haven't made videos of that are pretty simple I'll just describe now. But things that I've done, I've removed obviously the rear bumper. I've removed the big frame that is behind the bumper here. I haven't made a video on that. It just has 6 M8 screws, 3 on each side that take 23 Newton meters. That just comes off very easily. On the inside of where the bumper was, there's a small frame which it's a support for the bumper. That has 3 screws that can easily be removed. There's a piece of heat insulation that sits along here, as well as the big one underneath there. They're pretty easy to remove. They just sit on these studs here with some nuts. See, once it comes off, because with the exhaust, it's much easier to remove that with the bits on the side here removed. I haven't made a video of that, but they just have 4 nuts. There's 2 there, 1 there, and 1 on the inside, and they just pull straight off. So you do that on both sides, and the exhaust just comes out much more easily afterwards. I've removed the subframe, and I've also just dropped the sway bar there, so when I drain the fluid, it just doesn't get all over the place. Once I did that, I've disconnected the coolant hoses. I haven't drained the coolant, which is just going to make it much easier later on. All I did, I have these vice grips that have this long section with soft jaws in the middle here. You just clamp it in there, seal it off, pull these off, and with that there, it's really easy to just give those a wiggle and they pop off the connections for the oil cooler. And then I've just plugged those, so they're just sitting there off to the side. I have disconnected the connector here for the gear oil temperature sensor, and I've disconnected the ball joint there for the park lock, so that just pulls straight off. This one up the back here, this is, if you want a closer description of how this all works, have a look at my transmission removal video, but in a nutshell, this one sits there like that. There'll be a single screw there which goes into here onto the disc valve, so you can disconnect that, which allows this to come more free. But to disconnect this thing from here, that slot there, you just get a little pick tool, put it in the side and in there, and just push it forwards, and then that whole thing just slides straight out. There are also 2 screws there that hold that to the casing, so I can just get that out of the way. And now I can easily move all that off to the side. And now I'm at the position where I can remove the gear oil cooler. There's 5 screws there. The oil cooler comes off. There's the gasket in between. And then there are a couple of screws on the other side that hold the port plate, which is the thing that this is bolted to and which is attaches to the transmission. They can come out. That'll have the little pump in it. That's pretty simple to remove. Again, look at the video that I've made. I'll put links down the bottom. And then we're just going to remove the caps, remove the circlips, remove the screws here, as well as that single one on the gear idler shaft for reverse, and then we're just going to pop the thing off and remove the distance sensor. I've removed the oil pump and the cooler from here. Points to note, all the screws, they're aluminium. They only have 2.4 Newton meters on them. They'll need to replace those. I personally would replace those with steel screws. All the screws have Loctite on them, so I would do that on install. The pump itself, there's lots of little nooks and crannies here that'll be full of dirt and stuff, so as you pull this off, then you'll have to cover everything up, or even before you do this, get some compressed air in here and blow everything out, so there's no grit or anything, because there's a couple like in that little spot in there, and down in here there was just loads of gunk. For all the screws around the outside, just take it easy on those there. M8 aluminium, they take 6 Newton meters on install. They'll need to be replaced. And the last one that you need to remove is that one there. Don't confuse it with the one with the Allen key here. It's not that one. That's a pressure testing port for the pump here. It's this one up here which is in alignment with this sort of round bit here at the back of the transmission. When you're disconnecting the coolant pipes, just have a big bucket underneath it, because there's still going to be some coolant in here in between where you've clamped it and the plug when you disconnect everything, and that'll stop everything making a big mess. But also, once you've disconnected these pipes and you've plugged them, the cooler itself, the coolant side of it, is still going to have a whole bunch of coolant in it, and as soon as you start to loosen these screws, that's just going to fall down anyway. That's fine, you can put a bucket underneath it, but the problem is that because the oil and the coolant side will now kind of get joined on the inside, if you like, between the gasket, you can get some oil down here. Now we're going to pull the cover off anyhow, but to save that happening, what you can do is, they are 19mm inside diameter hoses. If you just get a couple of bits of that, you'll have the two connections there. Put 2 bits of pipe, put that down into a bucket and just blow some compressed air through it, and that'll blow all of that coolant out of the cooler, so when you pull it off you don't have the problem of possibly getting some coolant inside the gear chamber. If you're going to use a tool like this is the way I'd recommend to set it up. The M10 bars that are threaded into the rear casing, make sure they are threaded all the way in as far as they go. I've just cut some ends here so I can put an 8mm spanner on this and put them all the way in. The bars that are pushing on the shafts, you can adjust the nuts on the end here so everything's at exactly the right distance, and then I'm going to tighten down the nuts on either side here so everything's nice and secure, and make sure everything is perfectly square. If you wanted to, you could measure the distances in here to make sure they're all even, to check that everything's nice and square. And the way I'm going to remove this is obviously I'm going to shorten this, which has the same effect as lengthening that. And the reason I prefer to do it like that rather than having something that turns on the inside is that the bit on the end of the shaft is the unstable bit. It's the bit that can move around. If I'm trying to twist that, that's going to make that quite hard. Whereas if I hold that steady and I turn these, it actually comes off, I find, much more easily. When I remove these, I am going to use a spanner, and I'm just going to go through a 180-degree turn one at a time, so this thing just gets pulled down evenly, because obviously if I do half a turn, it's a 1.5mm pitch thread. Each time I turn it's a 3/4 of a millimetre, and if I do that each time, it'll just nicely go down evenly, rather than just trying to guess it. In addition to that, prior to remove everything, once I've got the screws out, I've got 3 pieces of threaded rod here which are threaded into these. These are M8, which is the same size as the screws, and the reason I want to do that is because when this eventually comes free of the bearings at the back, it's going to want to flop down. And if you try and pull it off like that, especially with all this weight at the back, it can be a bit difficult to handle. But most importantly, right behind there is the pinion shaft end, and there's a big bearing, a needle roller bearing on the end of that. The problem is, if you're manhandling this, it's difficult to have that drop out of the casing. I had one drop out and break the cage, and that's not available as a spare. So you do not want that thing to fall out. So what I want to be able to do is have this, like, remove all of the tool at the back here, then gently slide this back, make sure that thing doesn't fall out. And also, that's why I've got this big box here. So if it does fall out, this is full of nice soft rag, so it's just going to fall down and not get damaged. Because for me, it's actually one of the most risky parts of this is if you break that bearing cage, that's going to be a difficult task to replace that. I'm in the process of trying to get one 3D printed, the cage, so I could reuse one that I've already broken, but for me, that is something you need to be really careful of. One thing also to be aware of when you first start to move the shafts out of the bearing, because they are a dry contact surface, they will give this really large crack, and then they will creak as they move out. That first large crack can be quite disconcerting, so be ready for that. If you are having to put a lot of force on these, something's wrong. Make sure you go around here, check that all the screws are removed, especially you remember the one at the top here for the idle gear shaft, because it's not going to obviously move without removing those. But the first bit, when it first cracks, will require a fair bit of force. For me now, I've done this a whole bunch of times and this thing will just slide out pretty easily because I've greased everything up. But that first time when it's dry, it'll require a bit of force, but excessive force is bad. So now this is completely free, but it's still sitting on the studs as well as a few of the bits on the inside of the transmission. So I'm going to remove the entire tool and then slowly move it back and try and get hold of the bearing. Now, if the bearing, when you look inside here and you start to remove this, if the bearing's sitting on top of the pinion shaft, that's great. If it's not there, it's going to be, and it's designed to clip into where it goes into the rear casing, but the clips break and it can easily pull, they can easily fall out. So if it is still inside there, don't just tip it down, keep it up like that so it keeps it in there until you can get in there and get your hands on it. If when you first disconnected the rear casing and you're still getting rid of the tool and everything at the back there, if it sort of comes back and it's sort of flopping down like that, and you're not ready to sort of pull it off yet, then just look in the back here, align it back up with the two shafts, and you just push it back on, and it sits there really solidly because there's a whole bunch of things that are holding it in place. And the nice thing about that is it'll just sit there quite happily, and then when you're ready to pull it off to make sure we grab that bearing, you can go ahead and do so. Okay, I can see that's just sitting on the pinion shaft there. There it is there. And it might be stuck in that little thing in there. The clips on this, and it's really important to notice the orientation of this. The little clips on the end go in the rear casing. They're designed to clip in the back, but oftentimes, as I've talked about, they don't. If you are installing this and it's not going to clip into the rear casing, I'm going to put it on the pinion shaft for installation. And you've got to look at the bearing cage. You can see that one's still slightly broken. It's the wide end that goes towards the front of the transmission, and the ones which is the skinnier end with the clips goes towards the rear. And from here, this has probably taken, I mean, I've been making videos and stuff, but it'll probably take about 2.5 hours or so to get to this position here. There's your distance sensor there. There are 3 screws that hold it on. 1, 2, 3. They're M5 and they are a class 10.9. Without any other specs on it, I am going to put 8 Newton meters on that. Round the other side up here is the speed sensor for the 2 input shafts. That screw is M5, but it's only a class 8.8, so I'm going to put 6 Newton meters on that. And the screws here, and the one on the other side there that hold the harness in place, they're M6 and they're 8.8, so I'm going to put 10 Newton meters on those. But this would be a case of remove the 2 screws for the speed sensor, the 4 for the distance sensor, the 2 that hold the harness in place. Note the routing of where the harness goes. The clip at the back here is going to push that forward, and then that's just going to come straight off. Disconnect the plug, push it out, and then the thing will just come straight out. What's interesting here, there's a big magnet down the bottom here which is designed to catch a whole bunch of gunk, all the debris off the gears, but the magnets on here are all covered in gunk. So with the distance sensor removed, I would be cleaning that up as well. Something else that was a little bit different at last time, I realised that you can just pull out the electrical cable from underneath these clips, so you don't need to disconnect those there. For interest's sake, that is the magnet that sits in the bottom, and that is the amount of gunge on it after 62,000 kilometres, as well as what's collected on the magnets on the shift rod sensors. The metal gasket that was around here, because the dowels have sat there in place, they just sat there nicely, didn't get bent, so I would quite happily reuse that. I'm just going to pull that off, clean it up, and clean up the face, make sure that's nice and clean. No oil on it, and I would use just a little bit of RTV sealant around that on both sides prior to install. When you're removing the screws from the top here, I would suggest using a magnetic tool to make sure that they don't get dropped. Whilst it's not going to go down into the transmission into here, but it's going to drop down into the gearing. So using a magnetic tool is going to help you out. Also this spot here, that's a hook in there, and that's going to be sitting behind there. That was a bit difficult to get out. Best way I found was, instead of sort of trying to reef it out, is to slide it out that way, and then in that round bit that hadn't been compressed and flattened, that popped out really easily. When you're removing the screws on the sensors, and also especially these ones here on those clips, these are T30, the sensors are T27. I would use a long extension that runs out the front and a breaker bar, so it's quite a long bar so you can really control it, because especially these ones here, even though they're only M6, they took quite a bit of force to get off, and if you didn't have a whole bunch of control to keep the thing forced in there and perfectly at 90 degrees, it would be easy to burr those off, so just be a bit careful there. This is something interesting that I didn't have with the other transmission. Because I've shut the car down in park, what that means is it's in first, which means that this shift rod here is forward, selecting first. What that also means now, I've got all the screws out of the distance sensor, it won't come out because the knob here, this little mounting knob, is hitting the shift fork. So what I'm going to have to do is move this rearward, but really critical that you put something on here, make sure these gears here cannot move rearwards when you do that, otherwise it'll bugger up the synchro mesh, so you can get this thing out. A close-up of one of the shift rod magnets. Look at all that gunk all over that. I'll just get my finger, scrape that off and clean that up. I'm going to do that to all four. Prior to buttoning everything up, I'm always going to put on the diagnostics and check that everything works. Prior to installation of the rear casing, amongst everything else, make sure this pipe here, this is the draw pipe for the gear oil cooler. The O-ring in here slots into a hole on the back of the rear casing. As you remove the rear casing, it'll probably just sort of pop out and sort of flop down like that. Make sure that's pushed all the way home into the correct position, ready for the rear casing to slot in over the top of that. When you're fitting the cover back on, make sure that the park lever is forward. You can put that into park later on once the cover is back on, but that needs to be forward. Align the two dowels and make sure you look through here and slot that on evenly. And when it's on, it feels really solid, like it just won't move a fraction of a millimetre, and the gap in here is going to be 15 millimetres. Interestingly, with the little circlips that live in these holes, the one at the top here was the one that popped out really easily last time. I just hit it with a screwdriver with a mallet and it turned at 90 degrees and I pulled it out. This time I just could not get it out. Nice thing is that that's at the end of the thread, so I don't really need to remove that. Whereas this one here, it came out more easily. So I squeezed it together, got a screwdriver underneath it, and then just levered that out, and they just popped out really easily. A couple of things I did differently when I put the rear casing on this time, which made it a little bit easier. The threaded bar, those three pieces that I had for the removal, I put those on, makes it much simpler to align everything so everything goes on straight. And when I'm putting these on, I put some marks here at 180 degrees, so when I was turning these on, I would turn it, because they're same, even though there's a different width bolts, they are the same thread pitch of 1.5 millimeters, so half a turn is 3/4 of a millimeter. So I was doing them half a turn each at a time to pull them in evenly, saving just trying to guess it. And also what I found was when I was turning this top one here, because obviously there's friction in between the washers here, this was turning this bush removal tool, which I'm using to pull the thing out with, which then, if that's turning, it means it's not actually pulling the thing through, the rod through. So what we needed to do was hold that in place. All I've done is just use, it's like a vice grip, but with the chain, hold that in place. That just holds up against there, so that held that in place, so it pulled it through evenly. Contrary to what I said in the other video that I made on fitting the oil pump in here, when you're fitting it, because the hex key on the pump impeller needs to align with the insides of the pinion shaft. It's a pretty loose fit, so it doesn't have to be exact, but the problem is that most of the time you're going to put it in there and the last 5 or 6 mils, it won't go in there because it's just not aligned. And instead of pulling the whole thing out, what I found was easiest is to pull it out a bit, and you'll see the edges of the impeller. And if you just get in there with a plastic pry tool, something that's clean, or a screwdriver, something that's not going to scratch it, and then just gently press it so it rotates the impeller and the pump just slightly, press it again, and just do that a couple of times until it aligns, and it's pretty obvious because it just slots straight in when it does. Well, I'm back to where I started this morning after I'd removed all the covers and everything. Everything's buttoned back up. It's not even 3 o'clock and I started about 9. So it gives you a bit of an idea of how much time this actually takes. A couple of things I still need to do. I need to fill it up with fluid, just put the exhaust on and crank it up and do a cal if that was required. One thing I didn't need to do that is because I wasn't fitting a new sensor, I didn't have to splice that in, so you'd probably add another half an hour. But I reckon it's a pretty easygoing day's work to get this job done. Certainly nothing more than that. So to do my test drive and do a cal if required, all I'm going to do is just put on the heat shield, hit 50 exhaust, everything else is left off. And the nice thing about PIWIS is I can use rolling test mode, so I can run through all the gears or do a cal or anything like that with a thing on the lift or on jack stands before I take it out on the road, because clearly if something goes wrong out on the road and you get stuck and you have to give a tow, that's not going to be much good. So to do it in the workshop like this is going to be much simpler. So I'll put it into rolling test mode. Once you've done that, you can actually then just go back into the transmission control and have a look at the outputs from the distance sensor if you want it. But the easiest thing to do now is just to put it into drive and then just gently put your foot on the accelerator or a stick on the accelerator, allow it to just run through the gears, take the foot off, the stick off the accelerator, let it come back through again, select reverse and do that over and over again just to check that everything's working okay.